this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Old English by focusing in on the vocabulary of Old English and some of the influences from outside, right? Some of the borrowings of Old English from other languages. Okay, so let's start out with something simple. I think I've mentioned before in this class that the vocabulary of modern English is somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million, maybe more. It really depends on how you count. Are you going to count all those technical science terms, then it kind of inflates. But it's still, even with the most conservative counting, is something in the many hundreds of thousands. And so it has a gigantic vocabulary. Comparatively, the Old English vocabulary was really small, right? So when Old English first formed, it had its set of words that belonged to it, its native vocabulary, and it was about 25,000 words. Incredibly tiny, comparatively, right? So where are we getting all these other words for? I mean, we've started to discuss this already. There's a lot of borrowing, there's a lot of creating and inventing of words that goes on. But in the Old English period, that number doesn't grow terribly much. There's not a lot of pooling in of new words. But there is some. There is a limited amount. So I want to talk about the three languages that Old English is either in contact with or has really had an impact on the vocabulary of Old English in this period. So I'm going to start with Celtic, actually. So we said, okay, the Celtic languages are those languages that were spoken in Britain before the Anglo-Saxon invasion. And so it's the sort of the native language, although we said, oh, there's actually even earlier languages that were spoken there. But it is essentially the native language of Britain, right? That being said, even though the Anglo-Saxons conquered them and lived amongst Celtic speakers, Celtic had a very tiny impact on Old English's vocabulary. Almost no words are pulled into Old English from Celtic. And in fact, mainly it's place names. So the Anglo-Saxons come there and they see a river, and instead of coming up with their own name, sometimes they'll just ask locals, what's that river called? And they'll say, oh, we call that the Thames. And so now that's in the English vocabulary, the Thames. It's not a native English word, they borrowed that. So there are a lot of place names in England, in that region, that are Celtic in nature, but not a lot of regular vocabulary words, right, for whatever reason, but probably because the Anglo-Saxons imposed their culture. They really didn't take a lot from the Celts. They required the Celts to really adopt their culture. And to the point where the Celtic languages die out in the region of England, right? They persist in Wales to the west and Scotland to the north, but in England proper, where the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are, they all die out. So they don't have a big impact. Next up is the question of Latin. Which is a little tricky because by the time that Old English really gets underway, right, we said like by 650 AD, Old English proper has come into existence. At this point, there aren't really any Latin speakers left, right, because the Western Roman Empire has fallen. The Eastern Roman Empire has reverted back to using Greek for everything. In the places that were once ruled by the Western Roman Empire, at this point, the Latin is transforming into the Romance languages, right? The vulgar Latin spoken around places is now becoming French and Portuguese and Italian and all of those things. So there's not a lot of direct contact with Latin speakers, and that kind of direct contact and exchange and interchange is how we pick up words often. So how are they going to get words from Latin if not through that kind of direct contact? Well, some borrowing happened earlier, right? Earlier in history. Back when the Germanic tribes were still speaking like Proto-Germanic, or even the later kind of Eastern, Northern, or Western Germanic languages that pop up. During that time, they would have been in contact with Romans. At a time when the Roman Empire was flourishing and people were speaking Latin, there would have been contact. And so they did pick up some words at that period, right? Words like street, which comes from Latin strata, and wine, which comes from Latin vinum, right? Those words are picked up by Germanic speakers in an earlier phase, and so Old English inherited them. They actually became part of Old English's native vocabulary because it inherited them, those words from the earlier Germanic phases. And so in that way, some Latin words did get in, right? Because they trace back to a time when Germanic speakers were in contact with Latin speakers more regularly. The other way that Latin words really get into English this time is via Christianity. So when the Anglo-Saxons conquer parts of Britain, right, and settle their kingdoms there, they are still practicing a kind of Germanic pagan religion. They're not Christians yet. And it's not until 597 AD that Pope Gregory I decides enough is enough. He's going to have them converted. So he sends a monk named Augustine and sends him off to England and says, convert the Anglo-Saxons. Augustine has pretty good luck. Augustine lands in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Kent. There's actually a couple different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England. But he ends up in Kent. The king of Kent at this time is Athelbrecht, I believe. Athelbrecht. He is married to a woman named Bertha, who is the daughter of the mayor of Paris. Right? Medieval history gets really fun. But she was already Christian. He continued to practice the sort of traditional pagan religion of the Anglo-Saxons, but she was already Christian. And so Augustine found a very favorable environment there because Bertha sort of convinced her husband to convert as well. And then once he was converted, he essentially required his men to convert. And from there it spreads. And really, within about a generation, pretty much all of the Anglo-Saxons in England have converted to Christianity. Now, for some of them, it may have simply been paying lip service and saying, oh, of course, I'll do it, and not really changing their beliefs. But it has at least spread throughout the population, the Anglo-Saxon population in England. Okay, so if you have this whole new religion with a lot of new ideas, you're going to need words for those ideas, right? You need a word for an angel, and for a mass, and for a hymn, right? Things you may not have had before. And where are you going to get those words from? You're going to get them from Latin, right? Because the monks that go and set up monasteries, the priests that set up churches, they are using Latin as the language of their religion. We said medieval Latin is emerging around this time, and its main role is the language of Christian masses and rites, and also Christian books like the Bible and other religious works. And so you're going to pick these words up from Latin. And so this is what we see, right? Old English picks up words like altar and pope. Which come from Latin words like papus here for pope, right? Sometimes the words come just from Latin, but there's also words that come ultimately from Greek via Latin. So we have the word hymnos, for instance, which is a Greek word. Latin first picked it up as hymnus. We get rid of the ending. We adopt it as hymn. Or similarly, Greek had the word angelos, right? It became angelus. In Latin, we drop that ending and we get angel. All right, so we're either taking them from Latin or from Greek via Latin, because remember, Greek is also, that Koine Greek was the language in which the New Testament was written, and so a lot of words relating to Christianity come ultimately from Greek for that reason. Okay, so the number of words that we get from Latin in this period is still pretty tiny. It's almost nothing compared to what will come. And these are really the context of very, very few words that got borrowed earlier than Old English was formed, and then some words relating to Christianity and Christian ideas, thanks to the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon population to Christianity at this time, and the need for them to learn new words relating to their new religion. All right, I want to talk about one other language, though, and its impact on Old English, and that language is Old Norse. One of Old English's closest relatives. Old Norse is a North Germanic language. So we said some of those Proto-Germanic speakers went north to Scandinavia, places like Norway and Sweden, and they developed North Germanic languages, including Old Norse. Old Norse specifically is the language of a group called the Vikings, who live up in Scandinavia. Since it only broke apart, Old English and Old Norse break apart pretty recently, historically, right? Because they have a very common ancestor in Proto-Germanic. They're really similar. Their vocabulary is very similar. Their use of endings and grammar is very similar, right? They're closely related. But English, despite how close they are, English still picks up a lot of words from Old Norse. So let's look at the historical reasons for that. What it really comes down to is the Vikings begin to raid England. This begins in the 8th century. AD, right? The Vikings raid England. And at first these raids are kind of smash and grab. They go, they get some livestock and gold stuff and people to use as slaves. They take what they can get, they leave, and they go back home. But eventually there is an idea of settling in England and establishing their own kingdoms. And so we begin to see Vikings who are fighting for a piece of land. Very notably, in 878 AD, We have a pitched battle between Guthrum, the king of the Danes. Oh, that should be Guthrum, the king of the Danes, and Alfred, the king of Wessex, which is one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England. Right. And so they fight a battle in 878, and it ends with a treaty. It's called the Treaty of Wedmore. And what it says is, part of England is handed over to the Vikings to settle and establish their own independent kingdom. This region of England is known as the Danelaw, because it's where the law of the Danes rules. And so we see this kingdom pop up, this Viking kingdom of people speaking Old Norse. And so Old Norse speakers and Old English speakers are now neighbors, right? They are probably intermarrying, they're trading with each other, they're hanging out together. The kind of everyday interactions that's going to allow language to move from words to move from one language to the other. So because of the nature of this interaction, it's just kind of like common daily life sort of interactions. It's not specific like, via church or via science or some specific context like that. The kinds of words that Old English picked up from Old Norse tend to be pretty common everyday words. Sometimes Old English replaced a word in their vocabulary with an Old Norse word. All right, so sometimes the Old Norse word replaces the Old English word for something. So, very confusingly, Old English had this word eya. It didn't mean eye, it meant an egg. And the Old Norse word was egg, and so Old English just picked up egg. They started saying egg, this became obsolete, right, instead. Similarly, the Old English word scale eventually became obsolete when they adopted the Old Norse word sky instead. Or the Old English word yifu became obsolete. They adopted the Old Norse word gift instead. And so sometimes they pick up an Old Norse word and they just use it instead of their own word for something, even these very common everyday words. In other cases, the Old Norse word gets picked up, but the Old English word doesn't go anywhere, and so they exist alongside each other in the English language. They just start to have different meanings, different senses. Old English had a word craft, right? The Old Norse form of that, version of that, is skill. Old English picked up skill and just kept it. And so in English now we have both skill and craft, pretty similar in meaning, but with slightly different senses. Similarly, Old English had a word shirt. The Old Norse version of that word was skirt. Old English picks up skirt, but uses it in a different way. They're both pieces of clothing, but they mean different types of clothing. Sometimes we pick up Old Norse words and we got rid of the Old English word entirely. Sometimes we kept both and they were similar but had slightly different senses in the language. So there are a number of words in the English language that date back from the Old English period, right, that enter the language in the Old English period that were borrowed just from Old Norse, including a lot of really common words because of the nature of the interactions there. Okay, so that's really the only sources of new vocabulary for Old English, and the number of words that get added is very tiny altogether, right? It's comparatively just maybe a few hundred at most, and so it doesn't make a big impact on the English language. That will be different in the coming periods. But at this point, Old English is just a pretty small language spoken in a very small region. Okay, thanks for watching. In our next videos, we'll start talking about Middle English. All right, bye.